the Nile flows northward through the desert, an impossibility of green cutting through an infinity of sand. And you stand on its western bank as the sun descends toward the horizon, painting the sky in layers of amber and rose and deepening purple, watching the water catch and hold the light as if it were something solid, something that could be gathered and stored against the coming darkness. The river is wide here, perhaps 300 paces from bank to bank, its surface moving with a slow certainty that has nothing to do with haste and everything to do with inevitability. The water traveling from the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean Sea as it has traveled for millions of years, as it will travel for millions more, indifferent to dynasties and empires, to the cities that rise along its banks and the monuments that claim to be eternal, but are, compared to the river itself, merely brief assertions of human will against the patient wearing away of time. Along the eastern bank, palm trees rise in silhouette against the fading light, their fronds moving in the evening breeze that always comes at this hour, the desert exhaling the day's heat and drawing in the cooler air from the north. And between the palms, you can see the fields, the green strips of cultivation that follow the river's curve, that exist because the river exists, that would return to desert within a season if the water ceased its annual rising and falling, its gift of silt and moisture that makes agriculture possible, that makes civilization possible, that makes human life possible in what would otherwise be an uninhabitable wasteland. The air smells of river mud and cooking fires, of the acacia trees that grow along the banks and the lotus flowers that bloom in the shallows. And somewhere in the distance, you hear the sound of voices, farmers calling to each other as they finish their day's work, children playing by the water's edge. The everyday sounds of a world that has existed here for 5,000 years, for 10,000, for as long as humans have walked upright and looked at this water and recognized its significance, its power, its mystery. But here is a question that has no simple answer, a puzzle that invites contemplation without demanding resolution. Why does the Nile flow north when all logic suggests it should flow south, when the source is higher than the destination? Yes, but the path it takes seems to defy some deeper principle, some expectation built into human understanding of how water should behave, how rivers should move, how the world should arrange itself. The ancient Egyptians had their answer. The river flowed from the realm of the gods, from a sacred source beyond human geography. And its northward journey was not a quirk of topography, but a deliberate gift, a bridge between divine and earthly realms. And while we now understand the mechanics of elevation and gravity, of the East African highlands and the Mediterranean basin, perhaps their answer was not wrong, but merely expressed in different language, acknowledged a mystery that our technical explanations somehow obscure even as they illuminate. Act 1. The official story. Let us begin with what we think we know, with the geography and history that has been mapped and measured and recorded in countless texts. The conventional understanding of this river and its relationship to human civilization. The Nile is the longest river in the world, stretching approximately 4,132 miles from its most distant source in the highlands of Burundi to its delta on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, and it flows through 11 countries, though the section we're concerned with tonight, the Egyptian Nile, represents only about 1/4 of its total length, beginning at Aswan, where the first cataract marks the traditional boundary between Egypt and Nubia, flowing north through 600 miles of desert before spreading into the fan-shaped delta that has been the breadbasket of this region since humans first learned to plant seeds and harvest grain. The river has two primary tributaries: the White Nile, which flows from Lake Victoria and carries a relatively constant volume throughout the year, and the Blue Nile, which originates in the Ethiopian highlands and swells dramatically during the summer monsoon season. And it is this seasonal variation in the Blue Nile that historically caused the annual inundation of Egypt, the rising of the waters that deposited rich silt across the floodplain and made agriculture possible without irrigation, that defined the rhythm of Egyptian life and became central to Egyptian religion and culture, the rising waters representing renewal and fertility, the receding waters representing death and return, the eternal cycle that the civilization built itself upon. Ancient Egyptian society organized itself around this cycle, dividing the year into 3 seasons. Akhet, the flooding season from July to November; Peret, the growing season from November to March; and Shamu, the harvest season from March to July. And the precision with which they tracked these seasons, the accuracy with which they predicted the river's behavior, suggests a sophistication in astronomical observation and calendrical mathematics that we're only beginning to fully appreciate, that required generations of careful record-keeping and transmission of knowledge through priestly lineages that maintained continuity across centuries. The civilization that grew along these banks lasted in various forms for approximately 3,000 years, from the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BC to the Roman conquest in 30 BC, making it one of the longest continuous civilizations in human history. And throughout those millennia, the river remained central, the source of life and prosperity, the highway for trade and travel. The reason why Egypt existed at all. Why it could develop such wealth and power. Why it could undertake the massive construction projects that still astound us today. The pyramids and temples that required not just labor, but also the agricultural surplus to feed that labor. The stability to plan across decades. The confidence that the river would continue its annual gift, would not fail, would sustain the civilization as it had sustained their ancestors. This is the standard narrative, the story taught in every history class, and it is accurate as far as it goes. Yet there are elements that don't quite fit, details that accumulate gradually until you begin to wonder if perhaps the official story, while true in its broad outlines, nonetheless misses something essential about the relationship between this river and the people who built their entire civilization around its rhythms, who seemed to understand something about it that goes beyond simple agricultural pragmatism, who treated it not merely as a resource, but as something sacred, something that connected earth to heaven, time to eternity, the human to the divine. Act 2. The first crack. Consider the temples, the great stone structures that line the river from Aswan to the delta, and notice how they're positioned, how they relate to the water, how they incorporate the river into their architecture and their ritual practice in ways that seem to go beyond practical necessity. At Karnak, the largest temple complex in Egypt, the main axis of the great Temple of Amun aligns precisely with the winter solstice sunrise, and the temple's proximity to the Nile is not accidental, but integral to its design, with a canal connecting the temple to the river so that the sacred bark of the god could be floated during festival processions. But more than this, the temple's entire orientation seems calculated to create specific relationships between the building, the river, the sun, and the stars. Relationships that the conventional interpretation treats as primarily ceremonial, but which might encode knowledge that we've lost, principles of design that we no longer understand. In 1891, a British astronomer named Joseph Norman Lockyer traveled through Egypt studying temple alignments, and he discovered that many of the major temples were oriented not just to the Nile, but to specific astronomical events as they would have occurred at the time of the temple's construction. And furthermore, that when you plotted these alignments on a map, they formed geometric patterns that seemed too precise to be coincidental. Angles and distances that repeated across hundreds of miles of river valley, suggesting either a level of coordination between different priesthoods across different time periods that seems historically implausible, or alternatively, some underlying principle of temple placement that was maintained across generations through tradition and religious law. Lockyer's work was largely dismissed by mainstream Egyptology, relegated to the category of archaeoastronomy, which was considered somewhat fringe, somewhat fanciful, the domain of enthusiasts rather than serious scholars. Yet his measurements were accurate, his documentation was thorough, and the patterns he identified were real, even if the interpretation remained controversial. Even if no one could quite explain how ancient builders, working without modern surveying equipment, could achieve such precision across such vast distances. The temples were not isolated structures, but part of a network, connected by the river, which served as both highway and metaphysical link. And the annual festival circuits that saw the god statues transported from temple to temple by boat seemed to trace a pattern, a sacred geography that mapped something more than just political territory, that encoded relationships between locations in ways that the ruins themselves no longer fully reveal, but which the ancient texts hint at, speaking of the body of Osiris scattered across the land, of sacred sites that marked specific parts of the divine anatomy, of Egypt itself as a terrestrial reflection of celestial patterns, the river representing the Milky Way, the temples representing specific constellations, the whole landscape transformed into a kind of three-dimensional star map that one could walk through, sail through, experience directly, rather than merely observe from a distance. Act 3. The Scientific Investigation. In the 1960s, a French team of archaeologists and engineers conducted a comprehensive survey of temple sites along the Nile before the construction of the Aswan High Dam would flood many of these locations forever. And in their documentation, intended simply to create a record before inundation, they noticed anomalies in the positioning and construction of these ancient structures that warranted further investigation. They measured the distances between major temple complexes and found that certain intervals repeated with statistical significance. Every 18.6 miles, every 37.2 miles, every 55.8 miles. These numbers appearing far more frequently than random distribution would predict. And when they converted these distances to ancient Egyptian measurements, specifically to royal cubits of approximately 20.6 inches, the numbers resolved into simple integers: 50,000 cubits, 100,000 cubits, 150,000 cubits, suggesting that someone, at some point, had laid out these sites according to a master plan that covered hundreds of miles of river valley. But this seemed impossible because the temples were built over a span of more than 2,000 years by different pharaohs, different dynasties, sometimes separated by centuries of political chaos and foreign invasion. Yet the spacing maintained its mathematical precision, as if there were invisible markers on the landscape that each generation of builders honored. As if the knowledge of where temples should be placed was preserved across time through some mechanism that left no trace in the historical record. No written instructions, no architectural plans, just the built reality of structures appearing at exactly the predicted distances, despite the vastness of time between their constructions. The team tried to determine how such measurements could have been made with ancient technology, and they conducted experiments with ropes and surveying rods, with astronomical sightlines and geometrical principles known to ancient Egypt. And while they could achieve accuracy over short distances, maintaining precision across 50 or 100 miles proved extraordinarily difficult. The errors accumulating with each measurement, each angle slightly off, until by the end of the distance, the placement could be wrong by hundreds of cubits. Yet the actual temples deviated by no more than a few dozen cubits from the predicted positions, an accuracy that seemed to require either repeated verification across the entire distance, which would take weeks or months of continuous surveying, or some other method entirely, some principle of measurement that we haven't considered because it doesn't fit our assumptions about ancient capabilities. They documented water levels and flood patterns, noting that the temples were positioned just above the historical high water marks, not the high water marks of their own time, but apparently of some earlier era, some period when the Nile flooded to greater heights than it has in recorded history. And this suggested either remarkable prescience in anticipating future climate change. The river level has been gradually decreasing over millennia, or else the temples were positioned according to knowledge inherited from an earlier period, when the river behaved differently, when the floodplain extended further from the banks, when the entire landscape was configured in a way that only the oldest temples remember. The French team published their findings in technical journals, where they were noted by specialists and largely ignored by the broader academic community, filed away as interesting but inconclusive, curious but not paradigm-shifting, another set of data points that didn't quite fit the established narrative, but didn't quite overthrow it either, simply sat there in the literature, waiting for someone to synthesize them with other anomalies, other measurements, other mysteries, into a coherent, alternative explanation that could account for what the conventional understanding could not. Act 4. The impossibility. To understand the full scope of the challenge, we must consider what it would actually take to create the temple network that exists along the Nile, the logistical and technical requirements that the conventional timeline struggles to explain. The Great Temple at Abu Simbel, carved into solid rock during the reign of Ramesses II in the 13th century BC, is positioned so that twice each year, on February 22nd and October 22nd, the rising sun penetrates the temple's entire length, traveling through the entrance, down the hypostyle hall, through the sanctuary, to illuminate the statues in the inner chamber, a journey of approximately 200 feet through carefully aligned doorways and passages. And this alignment, which still functions after more than 3,000 years, requires precision in both the orientation of the temple entrance and the internal angles of the passages that seems remarkable for any era, but particularly for the Bronze Age. Modern archaeoastronomers have calculated that to achieve this alignment, the builders would need to know the precise azimuth of sunrise on those specific dates, would need to establish true north with accuracy better than 1 degree, would need to maintain straight passages through 200 feet of rock without significant deviation. And while the ancient Egyptians certainly had sophisticated astronomical knowledge, their calendar was one of the most accurate in the ancient world. The tools and methods that would have been required to transfer that astronomical knowledge into architectural reality with such precision are not evident in the archaeological record, are not described in any surviving texts, leave us wondering how they accomplished what they clearly accomplished, what techniques or technologies they possessed that have not survived or have not yet been recognized. And Abu Simbel is not unique. Similar solar alignments appear at temples throughout Egypt, each calibrated to specific dates, specific astronomical events, suggesting not isolated instances of careful positioning, but rather a systematic practice of encoding astronomical knowledge into architecture, of building structures that were simultaneously functional temples and precisely aligned observatories, that served religious purposes while also tracking the movements of celestial bodies with an accuracy that would not be matched in Europe until the advent of modern astronomy in the 17th century AD. Consider also the question of preservation. These alignments still function after more than 3 millennia, despite earthquakes, despite the gradual shifting of the Earth's axis due to precession, despite the settling of foundations and the weathering of stone. And this longevity itself seems to require engineering principles beyond what we typically credit to ancient builders, requires understanding of how structures deform over time, how to build in ways that anticipate and compensate for geological and astronomical changes, how to create works that will endure not just decades or centuries, but millennia without losing their fundamental functionality. In 1968, when the rising waters behind the Aswan High Dam threatened to submerge Abu Simbel, UNESCO organized an international effort to dismantle the entire temple complex and reconstruct it on higher ground. And the modern engineers faced enormous challenges in this task, required the most advanced techniques and equipment available, spent 4 years and $60 million moving the temple just 200 feet higher and 600 feet back from the river. And even with all these resources and technology, they struggled to maintain the astronomical alignments, had to make careful calculations to ensure that the solar penetration would still occur on the correct dates after the reconstruction. And one has to wonder how the original builders achieved such precision without cranes and lasers, without computer calculations and theodolites, without any of the tools that modern engineers consider essential for such work. Act 5. The hidden design. But perhaps we are again asking the wrong question by focusing on technique, when the more illuminating question concerns purpose. What these alignments meant to the people who created them. What knowledge or belief system motivated such extraordinary effort and precision? The ancient Egyptians conceived of their civilization as a terrestrial mirror of the heavens, with the Nile representing the earthly counterpart of the Milky Way, that luminous river of stars that flows across the night sky. And the temples along the Nile thus corresponded to specific stars or constellations, each temple marking a celestial location translated into earthly geography. Each ritual performed in these temples, echoing and reinforcing cosmic patterns, maintaining the connection between above and below, between the divine realm of the stars and the human realm of the river valley. The constellation Orion was particularly significant, identified with Osiris, the god of death and resurrection, and the 3 great pyramids of Giza, built more than a millennium before Abu Simbel, align with the 3 stars of Orion's belt, oriented so that the southern shaft from the king's chamber in the Great Pyramid pointed directly at Orion's belt as it would have appeared around 2500 BC, while the northern shaft pointed at the star Thuban in Draco, which was the pole star at that time, the point around which the entire night sky appeared to rotate. These alignments encode multiple layers of meaning. The mathematical, demonstrating sophisticated astronomical knowledge and engineering capability. The religious, connecting the Pharaoh's tomb to specific divine powers associated with particular stars. And the temporal, marking a specific moment in the slow cycle of precession, that 26,000-year wobble in Earth's axis that causes the position of stars to shift gradually over millennia, creating a kind of celestial calendar that measures time on a scale far exceeding human lifetimes, that spans ages rather than years. When you plot the major temple sites on a map and note their associated deities and astronomical correspondences, a pattern emerges. The temples form a terrestrial constellation, a map of sacred sites that mirrors the heavens. And traveling along the Nile from south to north becomes a kind of celestial journey, a pilgrimage through the stars made manifest on earth. Each temple a stopping point, each ritual a station in a larger cosmic drama that played out annually, cyclically, eternally. The annual flooding of the Nile coincided with the heliacal rising of the star Sirius, its first appearance in the dawn sky after a period of being invisible. And this event marked the beginning of the Egyptian New Year, was predicted weeks in advance by the priests who tracked the stars with obsessive precision, who understood that the heavens and the river were connected not by superstition, but by observable correlation, that Sirius rose just before the flood arrived, year after year, century after century, a celestial signal announcing the river's imminent transformation. This connection between star and river, between celestial event and earthly phenomenon, was not metaphorical to the ancient Egyptians, but literal, not symbolic, but actual. And their entire civilization organized itself around maintaining this connection, ensuring through ritual and architecture that the patterns would continue, that the stars would keep moving in their courses, and the river would keep rising on schedule, that the cosmic order would be preserved through human action, through the precise performance of ceremonies at precisely aligned temples on precisely determined dates. Act 6. The mystery deepens. What's equally curious is what's missing from the record, the gaps in documentation that suggest either loss through time or deliberate obscurity, knowledge that was considered too sacred or too dangerous to commit to writing, preserved instead through oral tradition and practical apprenticeship, through initiation into mysteries that were revealed gradually, in stages, to those deemed worthy of the knowledge. The Egyptian hieroglyphic texts contain vast amounts of religious literature, hymns and prayers, mythological narratives, funerary spells. But they contain surprisingly little practical information about how temples were designed or how astronomical observations were conducted, how the priests calculated dates or maintained alignments. And this absence is notable because the Egyptians were otherwise prodigious record keepers, documented everything from military campaigns to tax receipts, from letters to laundry lists. Yet, on the subject of their most sophisticated technical knowledge, their texts remain largely silent. There are tantalizing hints, references to the divine proportion in architectural contexts, mentions of star clocks and water clocks without detailed descriptions of how they functioned, allusions to books of foundation that supposedly contained the proper measurements and orientations for temple construction, but which have not survived or have not been identified in the existing corpus of texts. And we're left wondering whether these documents were lost or whether they never existed in written form, whether the knowledge was considered too important to risk documenting, too sacred, too profane, with written exposition. The Greek historian Herodotus, visiting Egypt around 450 BC, reported that the Egyptian priests possessed knowledge of astronomy and mathematics far exceeding anything available in Greece, that they could predict eclipses and planetary movements, that they understood geometric principles that the Greeks were only beginning to discover. Yet when he asked how they had acquired this knowledge, they told him it came from the gods, from Thoth, who invented writing and measurement, from Ptah, who created the world through spoken word and divine mathematics. And Herodotus, rational Greek that he was, dismissed these claims as mythology, as the sort of origin story every culture tells about its knowledge. Yet perhaps the priests were not being metaphorical. Perhaps they were expressing in religious language something that we might express differently, but which points to the same mystery. Knowledge that seems too sophisticated for its time. Capabilities that exceed what the conventional developmental timeline would predict. Later, Greek philosophers, Pythagoras, Plato, reportedly studied in Egypt, learned from the temple priests, and brought back to Greece mathematical and philosophical ideas that would become foundational to Western thought. The theorem of Pythagoras, the geometry of Euclid, the ideal forms of Plato. All of them possibly derived from or influenced by Egyptian temple knowledge, Egyptian sacred mathematics, Egyptian understandings of proportion and harmony that were not merely abstract intellectual exercises, but were understood as fundamental principles of cosmic order, patterns that governed everything from the structure of atoms to the movement of planets, from the proportions of the human body to the architecture of temples. Act 7. The pattern recognition. When you expand your view to include not just Egypt, but the broader ancient world, the pattern becomes more extensive and more puzzling, because similar precision in astronomical alignment, similar encoding of mathematical constants in architecture, similar sacred geographies appear across cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other, that developed independently, yet arrived at remarkably similar understandings of the relationship between heaven and earth, between mathematics and meaning, between built structures and cosmic order. The megaliths of Britain, Stonehenge, Avebury, Karnak, align with solar and lunar events, track the complex 18.6-year cycle of the moon's orbit, demonstrate astronomical knowledge that rivals what we find in Egypt, yet British stone circles predate Egyptian pyramids by centuries or millennia, belong to cultures that left no written records, that built with massive stones instead of precise masonry, yet achieved comparable precision in their astronomical alignments, suggesting either that this knowledge was more widespread in the ancient world than we realize, or that it was more ancient, inherited by both cultures from some earlier source. The temples of ancient India, the Mayan pyramids of Central America, the medicine wheels of North America, all show similar attention to celestial alignments, similar encoding of astronomical cycles into architecture, similar understanding that sacred buildings should not merely shelter ritual, but should also participate in cosmic patterns, should connect earthly practice to heavenly motion, should make visible and tangible the otherwise abstract mathematics of planetary cycles and stellar precession. This is not to suggest that all these cultures were in contact, though contact was certainly more extensive in the ancient world than we once believed, but rather to note that the impulse to align, to measure, to encode astronomical knowledge into permanent structures appears across human civilization with surprising consistency, suggests something fundamental about how humans understand their relationship to the cosmos, how they seek to ground themselves in patterns larger than individual life, how they create meaning through participation in cycles that transcend personal mortality. The Nile, then, becomes not unique, but rather exemplary, a particularly well-preserved and extensively documented instance of a practice that was once global, and the sophistication we find in Egyptian temple architecture might not represent the pinnacle of ancient achievement, but rather a late flowering of knowledge that was already ancient when Egypt was young, preserved and refined by Egyptian priesthoods, but originated in some earlier era, some earlier culture, about which we know almost nothing, except what their monuments and alignments still whisper to those patient enough to listen, careful enough to measure, humble enough to acknowledge that our ancestors might have known things we've forgotten, might have understood principles we're only now beginning to rediscover. Act 8. The Cosmic Connection. On clear nights along the Nile, when the moon is absent and the sky reveals its full glory, the stars appear not as distant points of light, but as near presences, as if you could reach up and touch them, as if the boundary between earth and sky were permeable, negotiable, a threshold that could be crossed through the right knowledge, the right ritual, the right frame of mind. The ancient Egyptians observed the sky with patient intensity, tracking not just the obvious patterns, the sun's daily arc, the moon's phases, but also the subtle movements, the slow drift of stars relative to the horizon over years and decades, the precession that shifts the pole star over millennia, the rare conjunctions of planets that occur once in a lifetime or once in many lifetimes, and they incorporated this knowledge into their calendar, into their myths, into their architecture, creating a civilization that was fundamentally oriented toward the heavens, that understood human life as embedded in cosmic cycles, that saw no contradiction between practical agriculture and celestial mysticism, because both were aspects of a unified understanding of how the world works. The Milky Way, that great river of stars that arches across the night sky, rises in the south just as the Nile flows from the south. And on certain nights, when atmospheric conditions are perfect, the Milky Way appears to merge with the river, the celestial water and the terrestrial water becoming one continuous, flowing presence. And standing on the bank, watching this phenomenon, one can understand viscerally what the ancient Egyptians meant when they said the Nile was a gift of the gods, was a connection between realms, was both physical water that sustained crops and cosmic water that sustained souls, both earthly reality and heavenly metaphor existing simultaneously without contradiction. The temples were designed to enhance this experience, to create moments of revelation where the connection between heaven and earth became undeniable, where light and shadow, stone and space combined to produce experiences of numinous power, of contact with something vast and eternal. And while we moderns might explain these experiences in terms of psychology and architecture, might reduce them to clever manipulations of perception, doing so perhaps misses the point, perhaps fails to acknowledge that whatever we call the experience, divine presence or neurological response, the experience itself was real, was transformative, was significant enough to justify the enormous investment of resources and effort that temple construction required. The star clocks found in tombs show the night sky divided into 36 segments, each associated with a particular 10-day period, called a decan. And by tracking which stars rose at dawn, Egyptian astronomers could determine the date with precision, could organize time in ways that acknowledged both the practical need for calendar management and the mystical understanding of time as sacred, as cyclical, as participating in eternal patterns that repeat at every scale, from the daily sunrise to the great precessional cycle that takes 26,000 years to complete. Act 9. The Sacred Space. There is a place within the great temple at Karnak, a small chamber deep in the complex, far from the public processional ways, that few tourists ever visit because it's not marked on maps, not included in standard tours. A space that seems almost deliberately hidden, almost forgotten, except by specialists who study temple architecture, and by the occasional pilgrim who seeks out such places with instinctive certainty, drawn by something they cannot name, but nonetheless trust. The chamber is approximately 12 feet square, carved from a single massive block of granite, the walls smooth and undecorated, except for a single hieroglyphic inscription near the ceiling that reads, in translation, "The silence that speaks," or perhaps "the sound that is silent." The Egyptian syntax allowing both interpretations, suggesting a paradox, a mystery that cannot be resolved through logic, but must be experienced directly. The acoustics of this chamber are extraordinary. Sounds made within it are absorbed rather than echoed, creating an effect of absolute silence that is almost tangible, almost oppressive. A silence so complete that you can hear your own heartbeat, can hear the blood moving through your veins, can hear sounds that ordinarily the ear never notices because they're drowned out by the ambient noise of the world. But in this chamber, there is no ambient noise. There is only you and the Sayyidah, and whatever you bring to the encounter. Ancient texts mention chambers of listening, where priests would go to hear the voice of the god, to receive oracles and prophecies, to commune with powers beyond the ordinary realm of sense and reason. And while we might skeptically dismiss such claims as priestcraft, as techniques for maintaining religious authority, spending time in this chamber makes you wonder whether perhaps the priests were being quite literal, whether in the profound silence that this space creates, the mind does indeed hear things differently, perceives patterns that ordinary consciousness filters out, accesses states of awareness that the constant noise of daily life keeps suppressed. Modern acoustic engineers who have studied such chambers speculate about infrasound, frequencies below the threshold of conscious hearing that nonetheless affect human physiology and psychology, that can induce states ranging from profound calm to existential dread, depending on the specific frequencies and amplitudes. And some have suggested that ancient architects deliberately designed spaces to produce particular acoustic effects, used granite and limestone in specific configurations to create resonances that would facilitate altered states of consciousness, would make the mystical experience more accessible, would bridge the gap between human and divine through carefully engineered manipulation of sound and silence. But this explanation while fascinating, still treats the chamber as a technology, a tool for achieving specific psychological effects. And perhaps this misses something essential, perhaps reduces mystery to mechanism in ways that, while not exactly wrong, nonetheless fail to honor the full significance of what such spaces represent. The earnest attempt by ancient architects and priests to create portals between realms, to make material structures that could mediate spiritual encounters, to build doorways that open not into other rooms, but into other states of being. Sitting in this chamber, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of stone above and around you, sensing the accumulated presence of centuries of prayers and meditations that have occurred in this space, you might feel something shifting, some boundary dissolving, some ordinary mode of perception giving way to something else. And whether you call this the presence of the god or the activation of latent neurological capacities matters less than the fact of the experience itself. The undeniable sense that something is happening, something real and significant and worthy of respect, even if it resists rational explanation. Act 10. The Hidden Depths. Modern archaeology has revealed that the temples we see today are often built on top of earlier structures, that each major temple site has been sacred for far longer than the visible architecture would suggest, that beneath the pylons and colonnades of the New Kingdom lie the foundations of Middle Kingdom temples, and beneath those lie Old Kingdom remains, and beneath those, sometimes, evidence of even earlier occupation, traces of wooden structures and mud brick enclosures that predate the stone temples by centuries or millennia. Ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies have mapped anomalies beneath major temple sites, geometric patterns in the substrate that appear too regular to be natural, that suggest constructed features that have never been excavated, tunnels and chambers and foundations that remain buried, preserved in the dry Egyptian soil, waiting for some future generation of archaeologists who might have better techniques, more resources, more time to undertake the painstaking work of excavation and analysis. At Abydos, one of the oldest cult centers in Egypt, dedicated to Osiris and associated with the first dynasties, excavations have revealed structures that push the timeline of Egyptian civilization back further than previously thought, that show sophisticated stone masonry in periods when conventional chronology says the Egyptians were still working primarily with mud brick. And the explanations offered, that perhaps the site was periodically renovated, that perhaps earlier materials were reused in later constructions, don't quite account for the stylistic and technical anomalies, don't quite resolve the questions that keep emerging the deeper archaeologists dig. Beneath the Sphinx at Giza, seismic surveys have detected voids, empty spaces in the bedrock that appear to be artificial chambers, though they have never been opened, never been confirmed through direct excavation, and various theories circulate about what these chambers might contain. Burial chambers, treasure vaults, libraries of ancient knowledge. Though the actual contents, if indeed the voids are chambers, and not merely natural cavities in the limestone, remain unknown, will perhaps remain unknown for decades more, because the Egyptian authorities are understandably cautious about disturbing such iconic monuments without compelling reason and solid methodology. The mystery multiplies with each new discovery, each new technique, each application of modern technology to ancient questions. And while we learn more with each passing year, while our understanding of ancient Egypt deepens and becomes more nuanced, nonetheless, the fundamental mysteries remain. The questions about origins and capabilities, about what the ancient Egyptians knew and how they knew it, about the purposes behind their extraordinary architectural achievements, and the meanings encoded in their geometric precision. And perhaps this is as it should be. Perhaps some mysteries are not meant to be solved completely, but rather to deepen with investigation, to reveal new layers of complexity with each answer, to ensure that we never arrive at final certainty, but rather continue the journey of discovery, continue the dialogue with the past that enriches our present and shapes our future. Act 11. The Cataclysm. Ancient Egyptian texts speak of Zep Tepi, the first time, a golden age before the historical dynasties, when the gods walked the earth, when knowledge was pure and complete, when the connection between heaven and earth was direct and unmediated. And while modern scholarship treats these references as mythology, as origin stories that every culture tells, nonetheless, they appear consistently across thousands of years of Egyptian literature, suggesting either remarkable continuity in mythological tradition, or perhaps preservation of actual historical memory, however distorted by time and retelling. The pyramid texts carved into tomb walls in the late 5th dynasty, but clearly drawing on much older sources, contain passages that speak of cataclysm, of floods and fires, of ages ending and new ages beginning, of knowledge preserved through catastrophe by those who survived, who carried forward the wisdom of the ancestors, even though the physical monuments and written records were destroyed, who became, in the next age, the mysterious teachers, the civilizing gods who brought knowledge to primitive survivors and helped them rebuild. Geological evidence confirms that the climate of North Africa changed dramatically around 10,000 BC. that what is now the Sahara Desert was then green savanna, watered by monsoons and flowing rivers, supporting diverse wildlife and human populations that left their traces in rock art and ancient campsites. And that this green Sahara dried out gradually over millennia until by 3000 BC the land had become largely desert, the human populations forced to concentrate along the Nile, the only reliable water source in an increasingly arid landscape. This climatic shift from green to desert would have been catastrophic for the populations living there, would have forced migrations and adaptations, would have concentrated surviving knowledge and culture along the river valley. And one might speculate that what we call ancient Egyptian civilization represents not a pristine beginning, but rather a reformation, a reconstitution of older knowledge by people who remembered better times, who preserved what they could of earlier wisdom and built their civilization around it, oriented themselves toward patterns that their ancestors had established in that earlier, greener age. The possibility remains that beneath the sands, in areas that are now desert but were once habitable, lie ruins of settlements and monuments that predate historical Egypt, that the civilization we know emerged not from primitive beginnings, but from sophisticated precedents that climatic catastrophe destroyed or buried, leaving only traces, only hints, only myths about gods and golden ages that might actually be distorted, memories of real places, real achievements, real knowledge that was nearly lost, but not quite, that survived in fragments, in temple traditions, in architectural principles that were maintained across centuries because they were recognized as sacred even when their original purpose was no longer fully understood. The cyclical view of time that pervades Egyptian thought, the daily cycle of sunrise and sunset representing death and rebirth, the annual cycle of flood and harvest representing destruction and renewal, the great cosmic cycles measured in millennia representing ages of creation and dissolution, might reflect not merely abstract philosophy, but lived experience, generational memory of actual catastrophes survived and overcome, actual knowledge lost and partially recovered, actual civilizations that rose and fell before the historical period began, leaving the survivors with a profound awareness of impermanence, of the fragility of human achievement, of the necessity of preserving essential knowledge through multiple forms, in writing and ritual, in architecture and astronomy, in myths and mathematics, so that if catastrophe came again, something would survive. Some bridge would remain connecting future generations to the wisdom of the past. The temples along the Nile, then, might serve not just as places of worship, but as repositories of knowledge, as archives encoded in stone that would outlast papyrus, as geometric texts written in architecture that would persist through ages of chaos and forgetting, designed by people who understood that civilizations are temporary, but the river is eternal, that human institutions fail, but the stars continue their ancient patterns, that everything built will eventually crumble, but the principles encoded in how it was built, the knowledge preserved in its proportions and alignments, might endure long enough to guide those who come after, who find the ruins and wonder, who measure and calculate, and slowly, over generations, reconstruct what was lost. Act 12. The Eternal Watch. And so we return to the river at twilight. Though night has now fully settled, the stars have emerged in their multitudes, and the Nile flows on in darkness as it flows in daylight, indifferent to human observation, to our questions and theories, to our wonder and our ignorance, moving with the same patient certainty it has moved with since before humans existed, since before the deserts formed, since before the mountains rose, flowing because the earth tilts and water seeks its level, because gravity pulls and the sea waits, because this is how rivers work, how they have always worked, how they will work long after our civilizations have become archaeology, become mystery, become myths told by distant descendants who wonder about us as we wonder about the ancients. The stars wheel overhead in their slow rotation. The constellations that the ancient Egyptians knew by different names, the patterns they saw as gods and sacred animals, the celestial geography that their temples mirrored and their rituals honored. And these same stars shine on the ruins now, on the temples that still stand and the temples that have fallen, on the chambers beneath the sand and the inscriptions worn smooth by wind and time, witnessing everything and judging nothing, simply present, simply continuing, simply being what they are in the vast cosmic patience that knows nothing of human urgency. Somewhere along the river, perhaps at this very moment, a boat moves through the darkness, its sail catching what little breeze stirs the night air, its passengers silent or speaking softly, making their way from one place to another, as boats have made their way for thousands of years, following the current north or working against it south, participating in the eternal commerce of the river, the movement of goods and people, of ideas and stories, of questions passed from one generation to the next, never fully answered, but never quite forgotten either, kept alive through asking, through wondering, through looking at the temples and the stars and the river, and sensing that there is more here than the obvious, more than the explained, more than the categories we've created to organize our understanding. You might imagine the ancient priests standing where you stand now, looking at the same river, the same stars, asking perhaps the same questions about origins and meanings, about how to preserve knowledge and how to honor mystery, about the relationship between human aspiration and cosmic indifference, about whether the patterns they perceived in the heavens and encoded in their temples were discoveries or inventions, whether they were reading a message written in the structure of the universe or projecting their own meanings onto silent stone and silent stars, and whether this distinction even matters, whether truth exists independent of human interpretation, or whether truth is always already the marriage of observation and meaning, of fact and significance, of what is there and what we make of it. The river reflects the starlight, fragments it into thousands of glittering points that move and shift with the water's motion, a terrestrial echo of the celestial display. And watching this, you might feel time itself becoming fluid, might sense the boundaries between past and present dissolving, might recognize that standing here by this grey river under these stars, you are participating in the same experience that countless humans before you have participated in, that the essential encounter, person, river, stars, night, wonder, has remained constant even as civilizations rise and fall, even as languages change and gods are forgotten, and new understandings replace old certainties. The temples will continue to stand for a while longer, centuries or millennia, until wind and weather reduce them to rubble, until the stone itself returns to sand, until the last trace of human ambition has been erased from the landscape, and the river will flow through it all, patient and eternal, carrying its water from the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean Sea, supporting life along its banks, flooding and receding, rising and falling with the seasons, independent of human need, yet perfectly suited to it, as if the universe itself were designed to support consciousness, to allow beings who can wonder and measure and build, who can perceive patterns and create meanings, who can ask questions that have no answers, yet cannot stop asking them. Closing the threshold of sleep. The night deepens and the air grows cool as the desert releases the day's heat. And along the riverbank, the sounds of evening activity gradually fade into silence, the last conversations ending, the last fires burning down to embers, the last footsteps fading into distance, And what remains is the sound of the river itself, the quiet lapping of water against the bank, the whisper of current moving through reeds, the ancient voice of water speaking in a language older than words, older than thought, the first sound and the last sound, the sound that will continue when all human sounds have ceased. You might feel yourself settling, like the day settling into night, like the river settling into its channel, like the earth settling into its orbit around the sun, everything finding its proper place, its proper rhythm, its proper relationship to the larger patterns that contain it. And this settling brings with it a kind of peace, a release of the need to understand completely, to solve finally, to arrive at conclusions that close off further questions, because the questions are the point. The wondering is the goal. The journey along the river of inquiry has no final destination, but is rather its own reward, its own purpose, its own meaning. In your own place, wherever you are as you listen to these words, far from Egypt, perhaps, far from the Nile, far from temples and stars that seem impossibly distant, you might nonetheless feel connected to this ancient landscape, to these enduring mysteries, to the fundamental human experience of confronting vastness and complexity, of standing before monuments that exceed our individual lifespan and asking what they mean, what they preserve, what messages they carry from the deep past into the uncertain future. The bed where you lie is soft. The room is quiet. The familiar objects of your daily life surround you with their ordinary presence. And yet, for a moment, perhaps you've traveled. Perhaps you've stood by that ancient river. Perhaps you've felt the weight of time and the patience of water. Perhaps you've glimpsed the patterns that connect everything. Stars and rivers, temples and seasons, human aspiration and cosmic indifference, all of it woven together in ways that we perceive dimly, understand partially, appreciate deeply, even when we cannot fully explain. And now, with the images of flowing water and wheeling stars, of ancient stones and patient mysteries, you might allow yourself to drift, to release your hold on waking thoughts, to let the questions remain unanswered. The mysteries remain mysterious. The river flow on without your observation. To trust that everything that needs to continue will continue, that the patterns persist whether you attend to them or not, that you can safely let go, can sink into rest, can allow consciousness to dissolve like stars dissolving into dawn, like footprints dissolving into sand, like all distinct things dissolving eventually into the great, undifferentiated field from which they emerged and to which they return. The river of sleep is like the Nile, flows according to its own rhythm, cannot be hurried or controlled, can only be entered, can only be surrendered to, can only be trusted to carry you where you need to go, through landscapes of dream and depths of unconsciousness, through territories that have no geography, yet feel utterly real, through experiences that make no logical sense, yet possess their own compelling logic, their own truths that evaporate under rational analysis, but remain valid nonetheless, remain significant, remain worthy of the journey, even if you remember nothing upon waking. Your breathing slows, deepens, becomes like the river's movement, steady, rhythmic, inexorable, and your body grows heavy like stone, like the ancient blocks that form the temple walls, settled into place, solid, grounded, at rest. And your mind begins to wander, to drift, to follow currents that have no direction, yet move with certainty, that carry you along without effort, without resistance, through darkness that is not frightening, but welcoming, not empty, but full of potential, not an absence, but a presence, the darkness that holds everything, that contains all possibilities, that precedes all manifestation and receives all dissolution. The temples along the river stand in their eternal watch. The stars wheel through their ancient patterns. The Nile flows northward through the desert, carrying its gift of life. And all of this continues, will continue, has always continued. And you need not witness it, need not understand it, need not even think about it anymore, can simply let it be, can release yourself from the need to know, can drift into the state where knowing and not knowing merge, where questions and answers cease to be distinct, where the watcher and the watched become one, where separation dissolves and only the flow remains. Sleep comes not as destination, but as transformation, not as ending, but as continuation in a different mode, not as absence of consciousness, but as consciousness freed from its daily constraints, allowed to wander through inner landscapes as you might wander through ancient temples, discovering chambers within chambers, passages that lead deeper, meanings that unfold in layers, each revelation opening onto further mystery, each answer generating new questions, but gently now, softly now, without urgency, without demand, just the slow, patient exploration of inner space that mirrors the outer space of rivers and stars, temples and time. The last thought before sleep might be of water moving in darkness, of starlight reflected in ripples, of stone that remembers, of silence that speaks, or of nothing at all, just the sensation of falling, of floating, of dissolving into rest, into peace, into the timeless place where past and future collapse into an eternal present that is neither day nor night, neither waking nor sleeping, but something else entirely, something that cannot be named, but only experienced, something that the ancient Egyptians knew and built temples to honor, something that the river knows and carries in its flow, something that the stars know and trace in their wheeling, something that you know too, have always known, are knowing now as you let go, as you surrender, as you drift away into the welcoming darkness that awaits us all each night. The river flows, the stars turn, the temples stand, and you are part of it all, connected through invisible threads to everything that was and everything that will be. And this connection does not require your awareness, does not depend on your understanding, simply exists, simply is, simply continues. And you can rest in that, can trust that, can sleep in the certainty that you are held. You are part of the pattern. You are one note in the eternal symphony that plays whether anyone listens or not, that continues through all the ages of the world, through all the cycles of creation and dissolution, through all the catastrophes and rebirths, playing on, flowing on, turning on, forever and always, without beginning, without end, just the eternal, now that contains all times, the infinite here that contains all places, the vast mystery that contains all meanings and dissolves them all again into the silence from which they came, the silence that speaks, the sound that is silent, the answer that is the question, the journey that is the destination, the sleep that is the waking, the darkness that is the light, the end that is the beginning, and all of it flowing, all of it turning, all of it resting now, peaceful now, perfect now, complete now, whole now, still now, silent now, sleeping now, sleeping, sleeping, sleeping.